Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, a private equity fund worth R1.5 billion was launched last week and is poised to change the media landscape of the continent. Led by entrepreneur and social activist Dr. Pompigne-Mognard, she says that the Africa Media Fund is but one of many solutions to challenges of connectivity, broadcasting, broadband and practical elements of the fourth industrial revolution. So, change is on the cards, but what is the current state of the media landscape on the continent and what lies ahead, particularly in an age of increased digitalization? Well, a person who understands Africa's media well is the founder and chairman of the APO Group, a media relations consulting firm operating across Africa and the Middle East. Nicolas Pompigne-Mognard joins us now from our studios in Cape Town. Nicolas, thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program. So as you heard from the introduction there's a private fund that's putting in R1.5 billion into media across the continent. And I just wonder, is this being over-optimistic or is there genuinely value in African media at this time?
Well, the announcement of that fund, I actually read the press release. I think it will definitely be part of the solution because, in my view, the African media landscape, the Pan-African media landscape, is definitely under threat. I will, if you don't mind, Peter, I will answer your question in more detail, but I'd like to take that opportunity to congratulate the Springboks, obviously, for that big win. You know that Rugby Africa, APO Group is the main official sponsor of Rugby Africa. So again, congratulations to the Springboks. I spoke with Mark Alexander yesterday and I had the opportunity to congratulate him. So again, I'm here in South Africa. I'm so happy for South Africa and rugby. So coming back to the African media landscape, during the last 5 years, we've seen so many international media investing across the continent. We know that media like BBC has opened their biggest office outside of the UK. They opened that office in Nairobi. 300 journalists have been hired, which is a huge brain drain for the profession. We know that the Washington Post has announced a few, a year ago, that they were expanding their presence in Africa. We know that French media like Le Point, Le Monde, La Tribune opened subsidiaries dedicated to Africa. We know that Euronews launched a TV channel, Africa News. We know that Al Jazeera just opened headquarters, an office in Addis Ababa, and so on and so on. The list is actually quite long of those international media which are expanding across the continent. And I think if you connect the dots, we can all understand why suddenly, after spending decades undermining Africa and depicting in the world Africa as the hopeless continent, why suddenly those international media come to Africa, invest in Africa. That's because they are following the multinational companies. As you may know, according to the South African government, there is a bit more than 400 US headquartered company having an office here in South Africa. They used to be happy with their office in South Africa, but now they're expanding, and they're expanding with very ambitious plans. And of course, those plans comes with advertising budget and public relation budgets. Now the real problem, if you ask me, Peter, is that according to some market research company, in a country like Nigeria, for instance, the higher middle class is starting to spend more time watching the international media than the local media. And that is a trend I actually see everywhere I'm traveling across the continent. Only this year, I travel to probably 10 or 11 continents, and where I'm traveling, I'm always meeting media owners. I was recently with the chairman of the Ethiopia Broadcasting Corporation. I met executive at the RTS, which is Radio Television of Senegal. I was meeting in Zambia, etc., etc. And the trend is there. Clearly, the African population.
Why is that? Why are they opting for international media instead of our own?
Yeah, well, that's indeed the question we need to ask ourselves, and I'm kind of reaching the conclusion that it has to do with the content. When I'm saying that, I'm not referring to anything specifically. I mean, is it the technical quality of the content? It is the topic? Is it the way the topic is treated, et cetera, et cetera? It's a very important question. Why are the African kind of divorcing from their own media? I'm not sure I have the perfect answer to that.
All right. So one of the things that you do, and as a media relations and public relations entity, is to feed these news outlets positive news coming out of the continent. So does that mean that they're not taking that information, because international media has always been accused of just telling the negative side of Africa? So if they're coming in their numbers, this can't bode well for our image.
Well, there is an evolution. I mean, back 10 years ago when I created, 12 years ago when I created APO Group, clearly the narrative about Africa conveyed by the international media was mostly bad, all bad. We are talking about The Economist, the front page, the hopeless continent, etc., etc. And if you look at 12 years ago, if you look at the media coverage about Africa, it's definitely 99% about hunger, AIDS, and conflicts and stuff. So there is an evolution. More and more international media are spreading good news about the continent. That is not actually fixing the problem, because those are still international media telling stories about Africa. My problem is that stories about Africa should come in a balanced volume from the African media themselves. So having the international media landscape speaking a little bit better about Africa is okay, it's fine. But eventually my point is that, here in Cape Town, I can browse on so many international TV channels, but if I travel to New York, if I travel to Beijing, how many African media can I actually watch on my TV in my hotel? So again, we are talking about those international media, but really they are national media with international geographical coverage. So it's going better, but I think we're still not there. We're still not there. We need to rebalance the share of voice, clearly. And if you ask me to be more specific, I will give you one example which in the recent 2 years show me how bad this is and how that problem is still not fixed. You see, APO Group is the main official sponsor of World Rugby Association Rugby Africa, meaning we are in charge of promoting African rugby, not only in Africa but across the world. We are spending a lot of time and energy to explain the world that there is rugby all over Africa. Not only in South Africa, obviously, which is the champion of the world, but you need to know that there is rugby in Kenya and Uganda. Actually, back in 2002, there were 2 federations playing rugby. Now there are 38. By the way, I'll take a second to mention that this weekend on the 8th in Joburg will be the Africa Rugby 7 with the national 7 team of Uganda, Kenya, Zimbabwe competing for rugby fans. My point is, being in charge of promoting African rugby, we discussed with the Al Jazeera, the CNN, the New York Times, etc., to show them, okay, there is rugby in Africa. There is very interesting stories, human stories to tell about Africa. Well, while we were pushing as hard as we could to promote African rugby, one thing happened, which was a very unfortunate thing, is that a player from Zimbabwe posted a picture when the Zimbabwean team traveled to Tunisia, and that picture was about the one player or a few players allegedly sleeping in the street because Tunisia did not provide an hotel which was up to standard. Well, you remember that? I will tell you why you remember that. Because I am Nicolas Pompigne-Mognard. I'm in charge of promoting African rugby. I'm spending money and time, and with that picture, one picture, I'm going to tell you that the media coverage generated by that picture was bigger than the media coverage which is going to be generated by South Africa winning the World Cup.
Wow.
I'm telling you, and I know what I'm talking about. We had 3 articles from Reuters about that, those allegedly players sleeping in the street on Tunisia.
So Nicolas,
we had 3 articles on CNN. You know, so the problem with the international guys is that they are looking confirmations of what they think.
Yeah. So how do we fix this? And part of what the Africa Media Fund is going into is infrastructure, connectivity, and I'm talking, I guess, fiber and so on and so forth. Will that help us tell our stories and reach further and wider?
Absolutely. There are several angles. You know, I stepped down as the CEO a year ago, and I'm now the chairman, and I'm traveling across Africa, and one of the things I'm doing is I'm giving conferences. I'm going to journalism and public relation university and schools across Africa. I was in Makerere University, Addis Ababa University, the CESTI, which is the largest francophone journalism school in Africa, etc. And I gave probably 15 conferences in the last 6 months. And I'm discussing about that very topic, and we are discussing about possible solution. And clearly, we need to remind that media are companies in the sense that they need to invest. They need to retain talent. They need to be able to pay their talents. They need to invest in the technical, the cameras, etc., etc. And so they need money. And that is why I was so concerned when I saw those market research establishing that in Nigeria it's already the case, but in all parts of Africa there is a trend where African citizens are spending more time watching international media than national media, because that means two things. That means that first, right now, the African media are not in competition with the media next door. They are in competition with the CNN, with the BBC, with Al Jazeera. How do you compete with such an opponent? And the second thing is that, well, if that trend continue, in 5 years from now, if I am a multinational company and I want to spend money for advertisement in Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda, am I going to go to the leading TV channel in Kenya, leading TV channel in Ghana, leading TV channel in Uganda, or am I going to go to CNN? And as we know, CNN already has 6 programs dedicated to Africa, and the advertisers are African companies. But I predicted that in a couple of years there will be also multinational companies.
All right, and then perhaps a final question about the state of media. And for a long time, our governments, a lot of them, have not opened up the media spaces. Only the public broadcasters were allowed, and it was very controlled. Are you seeing a trend towards a freeing of that space and greater freedoms for the media generally across the continent, because it is such an important aspect of democracy?
Yeah, you see, when you look at media freedom, most people assume that Africa is one of the bad students in the classroom. You know, when you actually look at the figures, in 2018, there were 56 journalists killed across the world. Out of 6 only were in Africa, and they were in conflict zone like Somaliland, Somalia, and the Central African Republic. So what you learn from that is that the threat against media freedom has evolved. It's not about 10 or 15 years ago. It was about killing and etc. etc. Right now, the evolution is to be found in the ownership of the media landscape. The government will own its own media, but the government will use proxy to own and influence other media, which allegedly will be private media. So eventually, that media landscape will not be so independent. You have that problem, the ownership of the media landscape. You have also the government using. Government is usually a big advertiser, so government will also use the advertising budget to starve some media which are not in line, and of course, so you see there is different. The evolution of the press freedom in Africa is evolving a lot, and of course the main threat against media freedom as a whole, and that's the main. I think it's main threat, even compared to what I just mentioned, is the fact that in a lot of countries in Africa, for instance, I was in Uganda, I was in Zambia. Well, if you are a journalist, a reporter, you're going to be paid $10 for a story. Yeah. So when you are a journalist and you're paid $10 for a story, well, you need to feed your kids. Yeah. You need to buy them shoes. So if a minister or a company or a businessman, for that matter, is coming and giving you $50 to write something or to change something or not to write about something, or etc. Well, so you see the biggest threat against the media freedom are still to be found in the finance in the files.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, Nicolas, we're going to have another conversation again in the near future. But thank you so much indeed for joining us this day and giving us your insights about media across the continent. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, that was Nicolas Pompigne-Mognard joining us from our Cape Town studios, giving us an insight on the state of media across the continent. We're going to take a quick break, and after that we'll have more for you right here on Media Monitor.